Well, hello again. It's another week in our class. It's the 25th of June, so we're starting out on our journey learning about qualitative research methods. And you'll do this by reading 3 chapters in the textbook, 12, 13, and 14, on narrative research, ethnographic research, and case study research. But what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about some of the things that we had talked about last week in the discussion. So for instruments, a lot of you had I think the mistaken notion that Likert scale items are instruments themselves. No, Likert scale items are just one piece of an instrument. They're one item on a survey, maybe, is a Likert scale item. And so on a survey, you could have a bunch of Likert scale items, or you could have only one or two and different types of items that are not Likert scale, like other types of questions that ask, what is your age? Would not be a Likert scale item. But a Likert scale type item is one where people respond by saying strongly agree, strongly disagree, agree, strongly disagree, or agree, disagree, and maybe a neutral one in the middle, or slightly agree and slightly disagree. Those are the Likert scale items that we're talking about. But again, a Likert scale is just a type of scale used in an item that is on an instrument. So an instrument itself is a bigger picture item. It's something that has multiple questions in it, multiple ways of collecting data, and a lot of you got that right, where you have, these instruments that you found in the literature that might work to collect your data. Also with demographics. So demographics just is another way of saying you're collecting some general information about the population that's taking your survey or you're taking your instrument. So demographics would be things like your age, other important variables that might have to do with your study. If it's an educational study, you might ask about, if it's teachers, you might ask about what grade you teach, or if it's students, you might ask about what grade they're in. Age, again, it could be culture, background, that kind of thing, and years of experience. Those types of things are demographics. So the demographics part of a survey is important because oftentimes you want to compare the different items on the instrument based on demographics. So you might want to say that teachers who have large classes tend to respond this way on the instrument, whereas teachers who have small classes tend to respond this way. And in order to compare those, you have to collect that data in the same instrument. So you have to collect the data about class size if that's important to your study. Another point that I wanted to make is that the study that you propose in this class is not required to be completed. So you can create a study and you can propose a study is what you're going to do in this class, but you don't have to complete it. You just propose the study to be completed in the future. And if you want to complete it in the future, that's up to you, but it's not required for this class. But you are going to make a nice proposal that goes up to the point where you would collect data, but not to that point. You don't actually collect data. Let's see, another point. Okay, so academic achievement is often on a lot of your lists for what you might collect. This is an instrument. For instance, you could collect GPA information, or you could collect an achievement test. And I find, though, that things like GPA do not have enough variance to really get you any kind of significant statistical findings. In order for a good, strong statistical finding, you have to have pretty high variance in the performance of your participants on the instrument that you're collecting. So the best instruments from a quantitative point of view are those that when students take it, let's say it's a test, when students take that test, they're getting a very wide range of scores on that test, and there's a normal curve with it. So most students are going to range in a C or a B, and very few will get A's and very few will get F's. That's the idea. Actually, C would be the average score that most students should get, not B necessarily. So those are the types of instruments that you want to choose for a study simply because it's easier to get statistical significance on those types of instruments that have a lot of variance. GPA doesn't have a lot of variance. Most students score pretty well. They get a 3.0 to 4.0, most students. It's just the way it is in education. So that's not going to give you a lot of variance to get the statistical significance that you want. So it's better to pick a test, maybe a term paper, or not a term paper, a term test, or some instrument that will give you that higher level of variance when you choose an instrument. Okay, so let's take a look at qualitative research now. We're moving into this idea of qualitative research. And I wanted to talk about this, of course. Basically, this is a good way to put it. We're moving from numbers to experiences. So all the research methods that you've been learning about, from experimental to causal or causal comparative to correlation, they all have to do with numbers and collecting numbers. Even Likert scale items like strongly agree, strongly disagree, you often will, well, you almost always will convert those to numbers and then do some statistics on them to tell how people responded differently to that same question, maybe how people from different groups responded differently to that same Likert scale question. And so the instruments that we've been talking about are quantitative instruments and their numbers. Now we move on to qualitative methods of research, and we're focusing more on experiences. And I think some of you will resonate better maybe with this qualitative idea of doing research rather than the numbers side of things, simply because of maybe the way that you feel. A lot of people just kind of feel a little more comfortable with this idea of using experiences to tell one's story rather than numbers to always reveal what's going on. And one thing I should mention is that no matter what research method you choose, there are always limitations to that method. Research cannot be the only thing that we ever use to make good decisions. And I think I'll talk more about that in the future. All right, so numbers versus experiences. Okay, so what we're talking about now is experiences. We're talking about feelings. We're talking about people's understandings. That's what we talk about with qualitative research, not necessarily just the numbers. And so the three major methods of research are narrative, ethnographic, and case study research. And narrative research is about stories. It's about telling somebody's experience or story in a research study. So it's really not about finding, collecting a certain amount of numbers and getting the stats going on that. It's really more about describing one's experience. And so you can see this very sad picture of a boy looking through a fence maybe or something like that. It's a very sad picture, and it evokes this idea that this boy has a story, that there's something that has happened in his life. So narrative research is all about that. It's about gathering stories, collecting information about people's stories, usually through interviews, and then taking those and putting those in a chronological order to tell that person's story. Ethnographic research, the classic example of this type of research is going to the tribes of Africa and having these experiences with those tribes. Someone from maybe the USA or England or somewhere who hasn't experienced that goes to that tribe and becomes part of the tribe or describes that tribe in some detail. So it's really the study of cultures. But this is the classic example, but you can think about other examples that are cultures, but maybe not necessarily tribes of Africa or remote jungle Amazonians. But you could also think of a culture as maybe a sports team. And ethnographic research has been done on, the culture of a sports team, even locally, or the culture of a classroom in education. So it doesn't necessarily have to be tribes in some far off location, but it can also be just the culture of a group near home. And you look at the behaviors and shared beliefs of that culture and try to present a report that gives a good, clear description of these things. And then finally, case study research is study of a bounded system. And it's kind of unclear exactly what a bounded system means. But I think the point is that the researcher has to decide what their bounded system is. What is their case study? And then they take that group of people and they are going to give an in-depth look about the experiences, understandings, and feelings of those people. And so in this case, it could be schoolgirls from China. And they could have, they could talk about their experiences as school children or something like that. There's a lot of different case studies that could be done, but again, the methods for qualitative research are different than quantitative. It's not going to be collecting surveys or numeric instruments. It's going to be more interviews, more observations, and or even focus group interviews where you interview multiple people. It's going to be like that, not some numeric instrument. So it's very different. You're going to focus on feelings, experiences, not on numbers. So yeah, back to this graphic. It's not about numbers anymore. We're talking about different methods of research that you can use to gain a greater understanding of a specific group of people. Now, qualitative research is not as generalizable as quantitative. You can't say that everybody's like those people that you measured, and you have much smaller sample sizes in qualitative research. In fact, some narrative research studies just have a sample size of one person. You know, when we want to tell that person's story, we might just have one person that we interview and do some document analysis of the person's documents or information that they might have. So it's a very small sample. With ethnographic research, you're not talking about thousands or tens of thousands of people that you're trying to collect data from. Instead, you're talking about just maybe one tribe or one group. It's smaller. And same thing with case study. You know, it might be a small group of 10 school children. So that's something that's very different with qualitative research. Quantitative research, you're almost always trying to get a much higher group of people, as high a group of people as you can, or a high number of people that you can to participate in your research. That way it can be generalized to other populations. But qualitative research, that's not necessarily the point. The point is to gain a greater understanding of a specific group, and that specific group is smaller. So also with qualitative research, it takes much longer to complete a qualitative research study because you are, for instance, with this tribe here, you're spending months out there with the tribe and you're writing down all of your experiences and all of your observations and all of your interview notes. Or you're spending a long time out in the field. You're spending a whole semester or a whole year with the school children. And then only then at the end of the year can you make any conclusions about those people. And same thing with narrative. You're spending a lot of time with the person or people that you are interviewing to try to get a full and rich understanding. And that's the point of qualitative research too, is to be very much more descriptive and very much more in detail about what you're studying. So that's qualitative research in a nutshell. So let's take a look at the rest of the activities for this week. We have the chapters that I mentioned. You're going to talk about research design on quantitative research just simply because we have already read those. Do any of those seem to resonate with you? Would you like to do one such as survey research, correlational research? And whichever one you do want to do for your research proposal, and again, remember, you don't actually have to complete the study, but you do have to propose a good study. So when you have thought of one of these, you really want to go back to the chapter, get in depth on that method. Let's say it's correlational research that you're thinking about doing. So go back to the chapter, read about correlational research, get into depth to pretty good depth about what it's about, what are some of the drawbacks and strengths and weaknesses of this type of research, and what are the best ways to do it, and then propose a study, which you'll do in future assignments, to do that type of research. And then finally we have exam number 2 on research methods, and this covers chapters 7 through 14. So this is the quantitative and qualitative research methods that we've been reading about, and that includes the readings from this week, so you'll want to read those before you do the exam. But it includes 30 multiple choice questions again, and gives you 2 points each for those questions, 100 possible points. Actually, that's wrong. I need to change that. The points doesn't matter, it just weighs itself in the gradebook anyway. And I'll remove the bonus points questions too. You do get 2 attempts to complete the exam. If you choose to take advantage of that option, again, your grade will be based on the highest attempt score. And the time limit is 120 minutes or 2 hours. So hopefully it doesn't take you longer to do that test. You want to remember to give yourself time at the end of the week. Like let's say you want to take this on Saturday night. Make sure you start it before 10 p.m. I think it would be, so that you have the full 2 hours. I think it cuts off at 11:59 p.m. So you want to make sure that you have give yourself time to take it And if you are thinking about taking it twice, again, you'll need to start it earlier in the week to make sure that you get the chance to take it twice before it finishes. So I think that's everything for this week. I'm just going to look ahead a little bit here. So yeah, next week you do have a design participants procedures requirement, assignment required to submit. So we're going to talk more about these qualitative research methods. You're going to pick one of the methods, and then you're going to propose complete task 6 from the textbook for your type of quantitative research and submit it. For quantitative research proposals, and for qualitative research proposals, you're going to complete task 7 from the textbook, which is basically a qualitative research proposal, basically. So you're going to start to talk about who are your participants for your proposed research study. Who are your what are your instruments that you're going to include? You know, are you going to use the motivated strategies for learning questionnaire? What is the questionnaire? And we talked about that in our discussion last week. Hopefully you have some good guidance on that. And then what is the research design for your study? And include a figure or diagram of the research design. That means how is this designed? You know, if it's experimental, what are the control and treatment groups? Can you give me a nice diagram of what that looks like? What's the control? What's the treatment? Or if it's correlational, what is the dependent variable? What's the independent variable? How are they going to stack up? And then a procedure. And that just means what procedure will you follow? What steps will you take to collect the data? To, you know, what's the intervention? What's the, I guess in the experimental, we call it a treatment condition. How will you implement that? What's the timeline for implementing that? So that's procedure. And then for qualitative research, you're going to indicate the type of qualitative research, the participants for your setting or for your qualitative research study, your data collection, like what will the interviews entail, how often will you do them, or if it's observations, how often will you be observing, or if it's document analysis and so forth. And then the procedure there, so what will be the steps that you will take for the research study. So you choose either qualitative or quantitative research methods for your study, and then you do the activity for whichever one you have chosen. You don't have to do both qualitative and quantitative, you just do the one that you have chosen. If it's a quantitative study, then just do the quantitative requirements. And if it's a qualitative study, just do the qualitative requirements. Down below that assignment, on next week, I have the design participants procedures example too that you can kind of take a look at. And this is, again, one that scored fairly well. So take a look at that. But that's just for next week. So, but it's something to be looking ahead to a little bit as we continue on our journey learning about research.